Today, I want to propose an answer to the question, what is the influence of integral knowledge on the transformation of consciousness? And to anticipate my answer, I can say that it is through the experience of sympathy that our consciousness transforms from derivative knowledge to integral knowledge. And this transformation has the effect of changing and reorienting our moral disposition. And the problem I'm formulating here touches on the most fundamental aspects of our existence. And in order to talk about this, I will be drawing on the philosopher Henri Bergson. And my talk has three main parts. First, I'm going to talk about sympathy, and sympathy is the most fundamental type of integral knowledge. And it is a precondition for achieving higher forms of integral knowledge, which arise from certain transformations of consciousness. And I will show that these transformations are indispensable in the cultivation and evolution of morality. Now, Bergson had four major books, and I will draw on ideas from all four, starting with Time and Free Will, which had the French title and English subtitle, on the immediate data of consciousness. And in that first book, which made him famous, he described sympathy in order to understand the transformation of consciousness. And in his last book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, he connects the insights from all of his earlier works in order to understand morality as an evolutionary process made possible by certain transformations of consciousness. And that's the book that I will end my talk on. Now, between Matter and Memory, there was this little short essay he wrote called An Introduction to Metaphysics. And in it, he tried to give a very integral view, a holistic view of his philosophical method and thinking. And I'm going to discuss that text in the middle of my talk. So to just give the 30,000 foot, view, Bergson thinks that European industry, science, and materialism have lost contact with spirit, inner life, and nature. And science here means reductive mechanistic materialism in particular. Bergson himself drew heavily on scientific sources in psychology and evolution. His critique rests on the notion that inner life is integral knowledge, while the intellect produces derivative knowledge. And if we follow only derivative knowledge, we will lose contact with who we really are. So Bergson wants to put us back in touch with our concrete evolutionary selves, what he calls the élan vital. And he also calls this an integral view of life. Now, integral for Bergson is made possible by intuition. And intuition is something absolute, something complete, something holistic, and something perfect. And here, Bergson is in company with many philosophers from the history of Western philosophy, from Plato to Kant. But it's with these next three aspects that the very uniquely Bergson view arises. He says that intuition is concrete, it's something durational, and something intense. And intense is really important here. For understanding integral knowledge, we have to understand it as something intense because this brings in subjectivity. Intensity is something that we are concerned with. It's something we feel immediately. We say that that person is so intense, or that that sensation was intense, or that a love or a desire is intense. And on a side note, I'm working on a book currently called Intensity, on the nature and attunement of energy, which I'm working to get published through Columbia University Press. So intensity is a feeling, and one that can be very deeply personal. It is not a quantity, it's something dynamic, it's not something static. In order to define this more, this deeper, profound sense of intensity, Bergson explained it in terms of qualitative multiplicity. Qualitative multiplicity names the process in which consciousness evolves. And in order to explain qualitative multiplicity, Bergson analyzes the feeling of sympathy and pity. Sympathy is a feeling where we feel other people's feelings, basically. For Bergson, sympathy is this integral, intimate, concrete, and durational feeling, which can only arise when we interrupt our derivative knowledge. And I'll explain this more in a minute, but Bergson got this idea primarily from the work of Baruch Spinoza in the Ethics. And Spinoza talks about sympathy in the middle of a very intricate argument. I'm not going to go into the details of this. He wants to say that sympathy, it plays a part in his goal, which is to use reason to achieve an acquiescent blessedness. And this diagram comes from my website. Here's another one as well. I'm not going to get into the details of his argument, which is very complex. He, in fact, wants to say that pity should be avoided because it's dangerous and it makes people risk their lives and their well-being. But what's important for us is that Spinoza says pity is a type of emulation that is painful and saddening. And yet this is not all that it amounts to. There's something more to it. So in the corollary, he says we strive as far as we can to set the being we pity free from suffering. And then in the scholium, he says the desire to benefit another arising from pity or compassion is called benevolence. So Bergson takes away this question from this passage. How does the pain involved in compassion transform into benevolence? And he answers this question with his term qualitative multiplicity. It's the concrete reality of compassion in its continuous variation of qualities as it transforms the emotion rather than a state or a quantity or anything like that. So let's dive a bit deeper into this idea of qualitative multiplicity and the transformation in sympathy. At first, there's this feeling of pain, and we feel the other person suffering. Now, pain and sadness are typically abhorrent to us. We try to escape them, but not so in compassion. We actually turn our attention to the suffering and we attend to their pain. And Bergson calls this an aspiration downwards. Now, from pain to sadness is pretty obvious to see how that can happen. And Bergson actually adds to that fear. It's possible that that sadness turns into fear if we imagine that the fate of the other persons is our own and that we should suffer as they are. But then he quickly goes on to criticize this view given by La Rochefoucauld, who wanted to reduce sympathy to this egoistic attempt to curry favor from others motivated by a fear. This may be the case in some, situations, but genuine sympathy, in that case, we push away all of our distractions, especially self-interest. And in the most intense compassion, all sense of self-interest can fall away. And when we have this sense of compassion, we feel a kind of disgust at the call of our ego and at self-interest. And from here, it's much clearer how we can move into benevolence. So this intensity here that we're talking about is an evolution of the emotion. It's a transformation rather than a state or a quantity. And I have a little story to help illustrate this. So one day I was out with my friend John and we were skateboarding, and he's really good at skateboarding, much better than me. And he was trying to do a melon grab, which you can see him doing here. And I was filming him. Well, this day he didn't do so well. He fell down and hurt his knee. And I'm a little ashamed to say this, but at first I laughed. And I was standing there with the camera, as you can see. But then suddenly, like a bolt of lightning, I was like, oh my gosh, my friend is hurt. I need to help him. And I put down my phone and I ran over to make sure he was okay, and he was. But I later wondered, how could I laugh and not instantly feel this pain? Well, in this story, there's a really great metaphorical element here given by the camera. The fact that I was filming, looking through a screen, gave this level of detachment. The camera, is this metaphor for what Bergson wants to say derivative knowledge does. It deadens our emotions. It holds us back from feeling them. Just as the camera kept me back from sympathizing, so too derivative knowledge has this propensity to deaden our compassion. And Bergson takes this a step further. He says, yes, technology does this, but so does habit. And our intellect in general has this tendency to separate us from our feelings. The influence of derivative knowledge on consciousness is to transform it into something mechanical and insensitive. And while Bergson primarily has science and reductionism in mind here, it applies more generally to industrial civilization. We have become separated from what we experience, our emotions, our deeper selves. And there's prejudices and conventions coming from consumerism and colonial worldviews in which everything can be monetized and therefore turned into a number. And in this world, we would calculate and conceptualize everything through purely derivative notions. But suddenly, the emotion erupts and interrupts our self-interest. We are temporarily detached from seeking to extract advantage from the situation, and our egoism and self-interest suddenly appear distasteful and repulsive. When Russia recently invaded the Ukraine, I felt deeply mournful, and I think many people can relate how in that state of mind, one is repulsed by both the grind of daily life and especially the extreme self-interested egoism of capitalists and despots. The feeling of compassion is therefore this transformation of consciousness away from the ego. And I want to say one more thing about laughter. So Bergson actually had a whole book on laughter from 1900, and he describes how laughing is a way of using our intelligence and imagination to release ourselves from psychical tension. It can therefore, in some cases, be used as a coping mechanism by which we deaden our sense of pain and fear by interpreting it as comical, like in slapstick comedy. We tend to either sympathize or to laugh, and these two responses correspond to integral and derivative knowledge for Bergson. Laughter is a way of relieving the tension of fear that we are mechanical, that we face necessities, and that there are obstacles in life and to our plasticity and adaptability. We fear being mechanical and suffering the necessities of life, and laughter helps divert us away from feeling that fear and sorrow. And in this way, it can be a great blessing. But in both cases, Bergson thinks it is our intellect that is most at play in laughter, and especially in comedy. So the intellect, in both its analytical side and its more imaginative and comedic side, have this propensity to alienate us from our emotions and our integral selves and our relation to others. Now, sympathy, on the other hand, as I've said, achieves a type of integral knowledge. And this is drawing from his lectures at the Collège de France from 1904 on memory. He says that there are actually three types of integral knowledge. And the first is like a mother's love for their child, which arises from care. The mother knows the child in a way that can't be put into words. Someone may ask, a mother or a caregiver questions about their child, and they will always be, to some degree, impossible to communicate the depth of understanding they have. And this knowledge arises from love and care rather than from concepts. Second, we have the knowledge that an artist has for their creation, and this is, again, integral knowledge. Bergson is relying here on Félix Ravisson's interpretation of Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, where the artist is instructed to take in as many perspectives as possible in order to achieve an intuition of the inner animating principles of a physiognomy or of a character, a form of life, or of grace. One of the goals of the artist, according to Leonardo, is to represent the movement and plasticity of life as arising from a soul. The inner unity and intentionality of life is something that is never present all at once, but is still discoverable in the plurality of appearances. We sympathize with this inner life of things, and then we have to invent a way of suggesting or evoking this inner life to the viewer through a work of art. Bergson likened this to the movement generating the line of a curve. This movement must be considered as changing constantly at every moment, but also as having a unified intentionality. The intentionality of life is what the artist evokes, and an integral whole of that life form is something infinitely rich with details and complexities. And lastly, we have the knowledge of a philosopher who seeks integral knowledge of life, consciousness, and community. Philosophy envelops the integral knowledge of a mother as this sympathy and care, of an artist as observant and creative, but goes beyond these in order to understand our inner life and to return to our lived duration. So sympathy is essential, Bergson thinks, for this evolution of consciousness away from derivative knowledge to integral knowledge. The increasing intensity of the feeling of sympathy is a qualitative transformation of our consciousness. The feeling is an evolution and cannot be reduced to symbols or adequately expressed in words. It is also a transformation away from the tendency to cut up the world into concepts in order to extract advantage from it. In order to communicate this feeling, we will translate it into symbols using derivative knowledge. So we can think of, at first, there's sadness, and then there's fear, and then eventually benevolence. And these are marks put on a path. But these are only marks. They are not the path itself, nor is movement the points through which it travels. Both of these are static and derivative and symbolic, and that is the nature of our derivative knowledge in general. And all of this, Bergson thinks, all of our derivative knowledge is a mixture of habit, association, and induction. In order to get around in the world, we have to associate things, we have to make inductions, and inductions always imply that the past will resemble the future. So we try and extract something from our experience in order to benefit in the future. Now, this idea is put forward by Bergson in his book, The Influence of Habit on the Faculty of Thought, which you've probably noticed now is where I got the title of my talk from. And this book was very influential on Bergson. In it, he says that habit is something very ambivalent. It's both a blessing and a curse. It is both how we adapt to the changes in our environment and improve our body and mind, as well as turning us into machines, automata, and in this sense that it produces compulsions and involuntary repetitions of behavior or responses to our environment. It gives us both plasticity and rigidity. And he explains this partially through his idea of the double law of habit. Habit is something that works through the repetition or continuity of activity, but when we repeat an action, it becomes easier. So we can imagine practicing piano every day. Gradually, we become better at that action. Conversely, the second law of habit is that passivity tends to become insensible. If you need to get a shot every day, at first it hurts a lot, and gradually it is less sensible. Well, this is the general thing that happens to our consciousness. There's this gradual nullification through habit and custom. And when we get around in the world and we make these inductive kind of ways of understanding things, we have to ignore a lot of the qualitative detail of our experience and our memories. We have to suppress them as they are irrelevant to the action at hand. They would actually be a hindrance to accomplishing our tasks. Our focus-based attention is always simplifying what is most crucial to success. We need to extract the signs that present resemblances from the past in order to predict the future. Derivative knowledge, therefore, we substitute reality with general categories and abstract concepts. Even our practical inductive associations, which assume the future will resemble the past, are derived from past experience. They are extracted from that concrete experience, and always with the goal of extracting advantage from the situation. Derivative knowledge is therefore abstract, and it loses the complexity and relationality of our concrete life. So derivative knowledge is static, simplistic, and general, while reality is dynamic, complex, and ever evolving into the new. So derivative knowledge is practical, but without integral knowledge, we cannot grasp life and spirit. So again, this idea of integral and derivative comes from calculus, and we can think about this in terms of a curve versus a tangent. The integral describes the curve, and a curve is curving at every moment. It has no part of itself that is a straight line. A tangent, on the other hand, is a straight line, and it only touches the curve at one infinitesimally small point. But the curve is not composed of the tangents, and neither is reality, which is an integral reality, composed of the derivative reality, which we have extracted using our intellect. And we can apply this idea back to sympathy. At first, we have pain, which is a kind of tangent, sadness, compassion, and benevolence. And each one of these is a part of the whole, but it is only derived from it that we can give it these static representations. And this is what Ken Wilber calls developmental structuralism. Each one of these is dependent on the prior ones, but goes beyond it and holds it in potentiality with it. And we can see how for Bergson, this phenomenological description remains rooted in the complex developmental structure. So Bergson says in the introduction to metaphysics that metaphysics can be defined as the integral of experience. Integral here is a whole. It is this indescribably complex flux of feelings and emotions as unfolding in concrete duration. And Bergson gives us a really ingenious metaphor to think about this. When we look at a color spectrum, we can pick out blue and red, put them next to each other, and they seem totally different from each other. But if we move through the infinity of shades and minute gradations, we can see how they're actually connected. The current of our psychical energy traverses an infinity of continuous multiplicity of qualitative nuances. And red is like pain and blue is like benevolence. And our consciousness can pass from one to the other through an infinitely detailed qualitative multiplicity. And so therefore, in order to understand our duration, we must be able to think both qualitative difference and heterogeneity, and at the same time, continuity, emergent unity, and an integral whole. And Bergson takes this analogy one step further by reference to Newton's light experiment. So if you put daylight through a divergent prism, which I have here, it breaks that light into the color spectrum. Now, we can put that back together using a convergent lens. So the light goes back through the rainbow goes back through the convergent lens and it becomes daylight again. And what this shows is that the daylight for Bergson, analogously, is the integral unity of that infinite nuances and shades in the rainbow. The infinity of different colors are not assimilated in the daylight. They are not reduced down to a simpler form. Instead, they mutually augment each other and form a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Likewise, our lived duration is both an infinite multiplicity of details and an integral unity. And again, not by a mutual elimination, but by a constructive integration where the parts mutually amplify each other. The integral is therefore a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. The whole of someone's experience is greater than the sum of their memories and thoughts. And now I'm going to step into something a bit more complex. And I only want to touch on this briefly, but this is Bergson's idea of integral memory. He thinks that we carry our past around with us. Each of us have an infinity of details in our past where no two moments are exactly alike. And each moment of our life is irreversible and irrevocable. And while each of us carry our entire past around with us, our integral memory is basically unconscious. The closest we can come to being conscious of it, Bergson says, is in near-death experiences. This is our deeper self, though, which integrates all of our past experiences. Bergson calls this the concrete self, or the multiple unity of the self. And he explains this through his famous or perhaps infamous diagram of the inverted cone and the plane. At the base of the cone, we have pure memory, integral memory, this unconscious whole of one's past. He says that it is being, in the sense that it is irrevocable. It is what it is and cannot change. Although we can form a new relationship to this past, the past is nevertheless recorded, saved, and he thinks through itself, even if we neither remember it or experienced it in acts of perception. Memory is not merely a faculty, since faculties work intermittently, while the piling up of the past upon the past goes on without interruption, he says. And the past is preserved in itself automatically. Now, at the point, we have becoming, so being and becoming. And this is our body in a continuous flux embedded in the physical universe, which is represented by the plane P. So the cone represents this continuity between body and spirit, because memory for Bergson is our properly spiritual being and not merely contained in the brain. And Bergson takes this one step further in order to explain consciousness. Consciousness is a degree of tension between our pure memory and the becoming in the present. Consciousness always involves what Piaget called centration, which is the intensification of focus on some thoughts, images, objects, or desires through the repression of others. Even expertise in something depends on gathering everything relevant to a certain pursuit, but this always implies ignoring what is irrelevant. Consciousness operates on a certain plane by the exclusion of a great deal of complexity and detail. Now, all of that complexity and detail is in our integral past. Bergson likens this to the stars in the sky. There are an innumerable amount of stars in the sky, and so too, in our soul, there are an infinity of details. Now, when we have conscious experience, we contract that whole in varying degrees of tension. Each plane of consciousness, as he calls it, is an integral whole which organizes or reorganizes the integral past in an infinity of different ways on the cone. Bergson likened this to the movement of a kaleidoscope. Each plane of consciousness is like looking at the stars in the sky through a kaleidoscope, he says, in Matter and Memory. And I would love to go into more details on this. This is something I am really interested in, I've been working on a lot. And I go into this in detail in a book I'm working on publishing right now called Integrals of Experience on Bergson and Aristotle. I'm working on publishing that through the SUNY series on contemporary continental philosophy. So these transformations that occur within consciousness are like a kaleidoscope. The transformation happens as a whole, and the whole is in the parts, and all the parts organize and change in tandem with each other. Each degree of tension in consciousness is like a turn of the kaleidoscope, which reintegrates our memories to fit them together in a way that makes sense of things. When I think about Bergson, for example, my consciousness draws in all the memories related to that topic and pushes out everything that is a distraction to that topic. But the deeper we go, the more close we get to this integral self, the more we can gather that up, and the greater integral knowledge we are able to form. So metaphysics is thus a process in the evolution of consciousness occasioned by our observation, and this observation is both inner and outer, which requires that we get in touch with our deeper integral self. So metaphysics for Bergson is a type of empiricism, but he calls it true empiricism, which involves the observation of both inner and outer, and therefore both natural science and phenomenology. And by phenomenology, I just mean the study of the phenomenon of consciousness. I don't mean strictly the methods of Edmund Husserl, but the general human propensity to reflect on and attempt to learn from careful observation of inner life. Integral philosophy, therefore, involves science, self-reflection, devotion, and the cultivation of certain emotions. In 1903, Bergson had already described what would later be called transdisciplinary methodology, which he called metaphysics. And metaphysics gets a bad rap, and it has for a while. And I don't know if the name really is that important. What really matters is that certain practices are being cultivated. Sri Aurobindo himself used many different names as he saw fit in different contexts, as Debashish Banerjee has explained. I think that integral is a great word because it has this particular connotation of mathematical rigor. It reflects the analogy with calculus, and by extension, it reflects this commitment to observing and caring for the natural world. Therefore, the lessons learned from inner observation, self-care, and improvement form the paradigm through which science, art, and philosophy are integrated into ways of life. In order to do metaphysics, therefore, we must have a sympathy for this indescribable, ineffable depth of our life, of each of our lives and human life in general, for the fact that we have not fully understood ourselves. And this also takes courage to be vulnerable and to wade into uncertainty, and a passion for uncovering the truth. And lastly, before I stop, I just want to mention where this all leads to the morality as considered by Bergson as an evolution of consciousness. So morality for Bergson is based on integral knowledge. We saw how derivative knowledge arises from habit, and that habit transformation is for the most part aimed at extracting advantage from our environment and simplifying. Sympathy, on the other hand, is a transformation of our consciousness away from egocentration. The highest forms of morality for Bergson flow from the efforts of benevolent desires, which create and invent a better world. And in order to do that, we must rupture the static worldview in order to gain the integral. So he explains this in a contrast between open and closed morality. And closed morality is understood through closed systems in thermodynamics. It operates through derivative knowledge and custom. A society tries to extract the greatest advantage for society as a whole, but this always implies an us versus them, either in relation of citizen and foreigner or privileged and exploitable. Society and custom pretends to be unchanging and eternal. They say that things have always been this way and they can't or shouldn't be otherwise. And the organizations of power especially try to prevent any deviation from the status quo. Closed morality is therefore static, and it is a kind of societal enforcement of rules and norms working through social pressure to kind of pressure on us to level differences, to conform. And it homogenizes and generalizes. And it uses derivative knowledge at every step. An eye for an eye when it comes to justice, calculative reasoning of means and ends, and extracting advantage. On the other hand, open morality is dynamic. It's like open systems described in thermodynamics. It's an emergent structure, a dissipative structure, and it involves an evolution through the reintegration of individuals and community. And this, instead of being arising from pressure, arises from an aspiration, an opening of the soul and the heart. Integral morality requires an extra effort in addition to benevolence. So we saw how sympathy changes into benevolence. Well, we have to go another step further. We have to reimagine and invent our future. In order to invent a better society, we must evolve as individuals and as a species. And in order to do that, we have to interrupt our habits, these chains of habits that place us in harmful tendencies that Western society has propagated, industrial, consumeristic, colonial practices. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to break habits. Humans easily get stuck in their ways. Alia Al-Saji, who is a great interpreter of Bergson, has an analysis of this, and she has elaborated an entire ethics of interruption, which has the goal of transforming racializing patterns of perceptions and judgments. Her approach is based on Bergson's phenomenology of hesitation. Hesitation is this interval opened up between stimulus and response, in which we are able to reevaluate and open more possibilities of interpretation and therefore action. When consciousness hesitates, it can be transformed from its habitual ruts to something more caring, more innovative, and more faithful to our integral selves. Habit traps our consciousness on certain degrees of tensions, on certain planes of consciousness. And this is not really an I think, like Descartes says, but an I can. And in order to maintain this centration, we must repress other possibilities. And Al-Saji says this involves an I cannot, in the sense of refusing to see things in another way. This is where hesitation must come in. When habit is interrupted, we can reevaluate. I can't go further into the details of how she thinks this can be accomplished, but her approach is very promising, and it describes a method for consciousness transformation in exactly the sense I'm describing. And we should think also of the consumeristic consciousness, which transforms everything into a commodity. Rivers, forests, lands are riches to be plundered, but we must interrupt these habits if we are to save our planet. And here we can think of the water protectors in indigenous groups across the world. So I believe that the task of a philosopher is to facilitate these transformations of consciousness. Thank you so much for your sustained attention. Attention is, in fact, one of the most precious resources we have to invest. So thank you, and I'm